A very good evening to everyone. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our panel discussion hosted by John Keels X on forging corporate startup relationships in a developing ecosystem. I would now like to dive straight in and introduce our passionate, dedicated, and distinguished panel of speakers today that comprise of Ramesh Shanmuganathan, CIO at John Keels Group and CEO at John Keels IT, Jan Mueller, Head of Corporate Ventures and Digital Natives APAC at Microsoft, Rizni Faisal, Director and Head of Group M&A and Strategy at Hemas, and Oshada Sena Nayaka, COO Digital Transformation at Brandix. The discussion will be moderated by our very own Head of John Keels X and Head of Pre-Sales at John Keels IT, Vishant Vijay Singha. I would now like to invite Vishant to open the discussion. Over to you.
Sir, I think thanks, Mariam. I think we missed Vindhya, Head of Digital Sales and Chief Bank Assurance Officer at UL. Sorry about that, Vindhya. All good. I'll dive straight.
Apologies
I'll
on
dive
that,
straight.
Vindhya.
These things happen. I'll dive straight into it. I think it's a topic that all of us around this virtual panel and probably in the audience as well, something that we are very passionate about and sort of excited about, and we feel that this is an important thing, important element in our economy that we should sort of spark to life. Um, so just a bit of background, John Keels X, we completed our demo day in September. And prior to that, our 4-month pre-accelerator program. During this program, I was extremely impressed, right? Extremely proud of the 25 founding teams that was a part of this program. Their focus, their commitment to their startups, their commitment to learn, to absorb knowledge, to apply that knowledge, to apply the learning, move forward during one of the trickiest times in the history of Sri Lanka for obvious reasons, for everything that transpired. So these founders have something in them that spark, that fire in them that keeps pushing them forward, right? And that's the passionate about the idea, about their business, about their startup that keeps them moving forward. Running a startup is no easy task. We all know that, and that is why a startup would really require help from wherever they can get help, right? From multiple parties, friends, family, and the purpose of this discussion is we feel there's an important piece of that puzzle that can help startups, which is corporates, whatever size it may be. We owe it to these entrepreneurs to assist them in whatever way possible. And this assistance can happen in various ways in a win-win situation for all stakeholders involved. Otherwise, like any relationship, it may not work out well, it may fall apart. This is an era of heightened competition, but also an era of collaboration, as we are all seeing. So I'll dive straight to it. What we are going to discuss is exactly this. How we can really forge relationships with startups, a win-win relationship. Maybe I'll start with Ramesh and move on to the rest of the panel. I'll bring you all in one by one, probably. Would like to discuss why you believe corporate startup relationships are important. In a developing startup ecosystem, we believe Sri Lanka is in that activation phase in a startup ecosystem. Why are these relationships important? Ramesh, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I think, thanks, Vishant. I think it's important to kind of understand the point in time that we are in. I think if you look back, I think most of the organizations were trying to own the entire value chain, right? So today, I think that has become a concept of the past, right? Today, we talk of value ecosystems. More so because the opportunity for organizations to leverage each other's ideas, assets, experience, expertise is profound, right? So it will be foolhardy for an organization to think that they have to own the entire value chain from A to Z and operate in a kind of isolated manner, right? So today the opportunity is for organizations to kind of create the platform where anyone and everyone could contribute towards the aspiration of the organization, right? So I think that is where it is very important to kind of develop this ecosystem, because it's more like outside in than inside out, right? And it's important to also understand today knowledge is pervasive and accessible to everyone, right? So innovation is today, uh, I wouldn't say it's not equal to knowledge, right? It's how do you really apply knowledge to solve the problem that you have in the most optimal manner possible, right? So in the past, the optimal solution was within the four walls of the organization. No more the situation, right? So today, that's the opportunity that organizations have. So organizers would think that every problem needs to be solved within the confinements of the organization, won't last, right? Because there are going to be organizers who are going to better leverage other people's assets to solve the same problem in the most optimal way possible, and will be the organizer which will sustain and grow, right? And that's the opportunity that we have. So let me park myself there, let the others kind of maybe contribute to this.
Rizni, you want to go for it? Why you believe supporting startups in a developing ecosystem, these corporate relationships are important?
Thanks, Vishant. I do agree with what Ramesh said, but I think the panel here is mainly IT driven, so I'm coming from a slightly different background. In Hemat, as you know, we are mainly in healthcare and FMCG. When it comes to startups there, what we see is, especially during COVID, there were quite a few startups that came out, but they did not know how to kind of anchor. The problem statements are not properly defined, and most of these guys kind of disappeared over a period of time. So I do believe that in terms of working with corporates, that's a very important problem statement definition is one of the most important things. And I think subsequent questions will also address that. What can a corporate do to help a startup? It's predominantly, while information and knowledge is available, the larger corporates in different sectors are privy to the problems that are faced. It could be a technological advancement that will kind of take away an advantage of an existing player, but it also could be a completely different proposition. As if you compare Sri Lanka with some of the other neighboring countries, we are predominantly domestic driven, right? Our services are all to cater to a 2021 million population, whereas was there in Bangladesh last week, it's a completely different proposition there. It's that I think the corporates need to work closely with these startups to kind of put that problem statement out there and kind of broaden the mindsets. Over to you.
Thanks, Rizni. Porshada?
Yeah, Vishal. So I think it's a subject we are discussing today in terms of forging these corporate startup relationships at a moment where there's a lot of rapid changes happening on the macro environmental aspect. Post-COVID, we thought everything will be hunky-dory, but then look, it's almost economic Armageddon across the world, not just in Sri Lanka. And just recently, I've just seen that there's been rhetoric that's being created on how best to even support countries in terms of realigning debt restructuring and all of the sorts. But it brings us to an interesting conundrum of how are we going to support the startup ecosystem, which is imperative right now given the situation where their cost centers, their challenges has exponentially grown across a short span of time. In that sense, I think it's very important now. If I relate back to the global startup report provided by the Startup Genome just early this year, they have clearly identified that the Sri Lankan startup ecosystem is lacking early startup funding. That's one of the key impediments highlighted by them. Now, the issue here is if you look at the ground situation, this young generation of entrepreneurs are really running out of stamina in terms of driving it forward. And that's where I think Disney alluded to earlier, where certain aspects, I mean, they run off, not enough runaway for them to scale up. So I think that is where I think we should come into play in identifying how do we contribute to that early stage pre-seed, I would call pre-seed funding aspect one. Number two, we can discuss in detail as we go along. But the second point is also how do we create that sort of use cases and opportunities within subsectors for startups to ensure that they validate their products or ideas. So I think that's what John Keel's X, I mean, Ramesh, and we synced up again last year and early this year. That's what you all have been doing, which is fantastic. And I think that's where the sector has to come in. Yes, one aspect is providing early pre-seed funding and assistance in terms of financial backing, but more so also there are certain elements where we need to ensure that the private sector opens up different scenarios, provide opportunities. So because the world is going on open innovation, as Ramesh said, right? It's about leveraging on open innovation in ensuring that you use the startup ecosystem to bring in solutions for your business that can set your business apart and get an edge over the competition. So I think these are pivots that we can always discuss further in looking at how do we contribute. Just a thought at that, the again statistics from the Global Genome Report, just in 2018 of the sorts, the startup ecosystem value in Sri Lanka was just a mere $32 million. By today, it's grown to $228 million. It is not me speaking, it's a startup genome report which is absolutely independent, but also, of course, they've taken certain exits and IPOs to consideration as well. But you can see the tremendous momentum. So us as also a country, if we are going to have a more resilient and robust economic model, I think the digital economy piece, if you have to realize it, I think it's imperative that we empower and sustain the startup ecosystem. And there's no way we would pivot on digital economy unless if we do so. So I think it's a apt time that we are having this discussion, and look forward to discussing further pedantics as we go along, Shant.
Thanks, Oshada. Vindhya, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Vishant. So, coming from a corporate background, especially in today's age, day and age, it's important that we, stay ahead of the competition. And sometimes it is that, corporate culture, which acts as a challenge in terms of, coming up with, disruptive thinking. Because whatever said and done, the minds are conditioned in such a way, and sometimes corporates might, what is the risk appetite that a corporate would have, and also is it your expertise, right? Now, especially coming from insurtech background, we see the startup ecosystem is rapidly evolving. So just to give you an example, at Union Assurance, we have come up with a Click Life app, which is a self-servicing platform. And then we also have a product called Click Live, which is completely digital. And within 5 clicks, you can basically buy a product. But then the challenges that we had was, okay, unlike a traditional banking app where the customer interaction, the need for insurance app is very limited, how do we stay engaged with the customer? Because that engagement was needed for us for customer stickiness, right? And then when it comes to the Click Life product, how do we expand on the digital distribution channels, right? So the easiest way for us was we looked at the region and we looked at case studies like Prudential Pulse, which is great success stories, and that is where we thought it's important for us to tie up with startups. We've made quite good progress, and recently, for an example, we tied up with Tyaga, which we got to know through John Keel's X. Now, the other challenge that we had was in terms of our customer rewards team, we realized, we are not giving the best in-class experience to the customers. There were process efficiencies. So then we looked at, okay, who can partner with us? And regionally, if you look at how do they position insurance apps, then we understood their positioning as, health and fitness, wealth management, value proposition to customers. Then do we have that expertise, right? Would you want to take up a risk, invest there? So I believe it makes absolute sense for corporates, and I'm sure in your next few questions we can add more. Just wanted to bring a practical element of it.
Brilliant. Thanks for that example, Vindhya. Jan, before the next question, let's move to maybe your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, what I hear, obviously, what I liked was the funding challenges, right? If you hear about corporates lacking innovation, sometimes don't even understand the art of the possible. So if you really combine all of this, if you look at how to cultivate a startup ecosystem corporates are essential, right? Because corporates are providing, first of all, the hand-holding and the guidance to startups, in order to rise at a certain level, which then obviously attracts more investors, where they see the quality of the startups, which like addressing a real problem statement, right? So I think it's a bit more the holistic view where you have to look into it, and that's also kind of the playbook we have seen, for example, in countries like Singapore, where it is obviously from a government plus the corporate to start to cultivate the ecosystem, bringing up quality startups, but at the next step, actually attracting the investors. And then it becomes almost like a flywheel and things are evolving by itself. And you can see more and more startups actually being successful. And, you have the success stories, which again attracts more people. So I think that's important to understand. It's a combination where corporates are essential for kicking it off, which then, as I said before, will lead to the right success. So I think it's a combination of many things I heard so far on this panel. Corporates are basically essential. Also to note, corporates as a win-win here is really the art of the possible, because the corporates I'm talking about, some of corporates don't even know what's possible, right? If you talk about on a PowerPoint is one thing. If you show it live, right, via a startup, it's a different story, right? And that's something also helps corporates in investing time and working with startups, because it helps them on changing their own culture and becoming more innovative. So it's a win-win across different parts.
Absolutely. And so before my next question, I just want to dig a bit more on that seeing is believing bit, right? Would you have some maybe an example where you've seen this corporate actually, seeing the startup, tasting an early win, probably baby steps, that sort of approach, and then sort of moving on to a larger sort of relationship? Fascinating to hear that.
Well, you have different models, right? So what we have seen, for example, with DBS in Singapore early on, right? Just basically, from a top down, obviously, was very set clear expectation to their managing directors to see problem statements. And that was to Vinay's point, right? You want to see real problem statements and then basically peel the onion where you come to a point, okay, that is the root cause. How do we now address this root causes eventually by partnering with the startup and bringing them in? And obviously, what you also see at this point is something, where you then sometimes startups are, learning a lot, because sometimes startups can underestimate the difficulty and complexity of a big corporate, and not only from procurement onboarding, but also from how slow things can be. And we should also understand this completely two different worlds, right? A corporate is normally rather slow, where a startup is fast. Why they're fast? Because they have a certain amount of funding, and funding runs out at a certain point in time. So that's the first clash we see. So that's where we also need to find in corporates the right stakeholders. And from a successful one, I think that's what we have seen in the past from a DBS case. They made it work, where they brought the startups in very early on, created the prototypes, and brought it forward. But this is something where a whole organization, a whole corporate needs to work hand in hand. And it's not just the business, it's the IT, it's the procurement, it's all stages need to be ready and willing and make it work in getting these startups in. Startups running in the cloud, some companies, on-premise, it's the next thing to be considered. But there are successful cases. But then obviously we also have seen a lot of companies where I call it the death of prototype. Nothing goes beyond the prototype, hundreds of prototypes, nothing moves forward. And that's maybe where startups here in this panel have to be, or as listeners have to be mindful to also look at the startups, see if they're serious. Don't work for free, right? Always charge a little bit. This is the first test, and as my advice, charge a little bit, even if it's just $5. But this is a good test to see how serious this is, or if somebody's misusing this only for their own career ambitions. So just, my view, it's good. We have seen a lot of success, but we also have seen equally no momentum at all.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a journey. Thanks, Jan. Very interesting. So let's dig deeper into maybe reason. You can go for it. I think you touched upon this briefly when you were talking. What are the specific strengths, or what sort of elements, resources from a corporate should we lend out to startups? What should startups leverage when getting into a relationship, and then we can go to the others.
Thanks, Vishal. So the way a typical startup and a corporate would process the same information is quite diverse. Same problem statement, the infrastructure is different, the agility, the way a 30, 40-year-old company is set up is very different from a 1, 2-year-old company, because every information that comes are much more agile, and the chance of them pivoting is a lot higher. So for me, how I see this is most of the corporates, they do understand that obsolescence is going to happen within the industry. They do understand the trends that are there. It's just, I think Vinda touched on this as well. How do you set up an ecosystem outside where you do give the insight and don't influence? You let them do what they're doing. There has to be light touch. There has to be certain. You can't with listed entity. You can't have audit committees looking over monthly progress, and that happens quite a bit. Even in my past role as an investment banker, that happens. The way you look at an investment is very different. You need to unlearn before you learn how to look at a startup. So I think that's one of the prime things. I think a startup does have quite a bit of information, technical input. For FMCG, basic things like how to package, what's the most important thing, what does customers see. Quite a bit of investment that has gone in. Information is available, but there's very little that they do with it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So okay, so we have insights. Ramesh, what would you think that we have that startups we can offer to startups?
So I think let me kind of maybe draw an analogy of why corporates and startups are different and why they need to coexist, right? So today you can't ask a marathon runner to do a sprint or a sprint runner to do a marathon, right? It kind of comes with two different skill sets. But what is forcing us to actually have the hybrid personality to be a marathon runner and a sprinter is because today from physical world we have gradually moved to digital, and couple of them are digital natives who are 100% digital, right? So what is morphing is the edge, not the core, right? So corporates like us have always solved the problem at the core for our own organizations, not for the constituents who are at the edge, right? So increasingly you're seeing the perimeter is getting wider and the touch points are getting it's growing exponentially. So the challenge is in terms of how do we service all these constituents without losing control, right? Because corporates come from the whole thing of control, right? So the issue is how do you liberalize that in serving the constituents? So if you ask me what do corporates bring to the startup ecosystem is best practices, the rigorous, the cost focus, right? And in terms of also looking at a medium to long term planning, sometimes it may not be necessarily the done thing to do for a startup. So that's what, because startups we are looking at pivots, right? So the issue is why are we acknowledging there's a pivot is because we know that this idea might not succeed. So you might have to pivot, right? So that risk appetite normally corporates will not have, right? But that is the appetite that we are trying to manage through startups whilst preserving our corporate governance structures, right? So understandably, listed companies have audit committees, have to be transparent, have a mandate in terms of what they can and cannot do. Because when we started JKX, you know, my chairman said, we are not a venture capital, we can't do this. I said, so let's start small, and let's get a board mandate to say why we are doing it. So increasingly over the period of years, we might actually even endorse co-innovation where a business are willing to fund it, right? So it's a journey, right? So the whole thing is about understanding the strictures of a corporate and what the strictures of a startup, right? There's a best of breed that we're trying to create, fuse in the middle, right? And what is that we can learn from each other and co-create is the whole opportunity that we have. I don't think one is superior over the other, but it depends on the problem that we are trying to solve. And we got to kind of have the balancing act, play the balancing act. And that's where the corporate can play a role in terms of guidance, mentoring, the maturity. I think a lot of the startups have a great idea, but in terms of execution is where they fail, right? So corporates definitely can bring a structure in terms of better execution and governance mechanisms to kind of ensure that they're successful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ramesh. So we have insights, that knowledge, the domain expertise. We have that guidance, mentoring, Oshada, what are your thoughts? What are our strengths that we should lend to startups?
So Vishant, let me take example of the Nordic Innovation Hub, which is Sweden, right? I mean, just they've been minting unicorns at a rate. Just last year, they've literally up to date they've doubled up and got 35 unicorns going, and in fact, from 2016, it's a 4x growth. But is it overnight, right? It is not just a funding piece only. In fact, the venture capital also they hit an all-time high last year. If I remember, I think it's about 7.9 billion euros, an all-time high, and doubled up the total investment of the earlier year last year. But the reality is, it's sound policies coming into play, proper safety nets for startups, and I think also it is about ecosystem builders giving back to the community, and that is where we are talking about today, the private sector. So I think in that sense, taking that example ahead, now Sri Lanka is at a very interesting crossroad, because if we look at again, as I always relate back to the startup genome findings, one of the biggest impediments is the early stage funding or pre-seed funding, as we call it now. In Sweden, for example, they have access to even public funding, ensure that pre-seed funding is not something that only the private sector can carry on. But today in Sri Lanka, we are facing with a challenge where, for example, the state-led, ICTA-led incubator, which is Spiralation, which has incubated 130 plus successful startups, has run out of funding, and that's the reality, guys. I mean, as much as we go through restructuring of debts to restructuring of a complete economic infrastructure, there's no way that there's going to be funding to drive this through. So now that's a big concern for me, and I see there's opportunity for the private sector to come into play in terms of this. I would always say this pre-seed funding angle, thinking beyond just equity, thinking beyond just the returns. And I think that's a new adage we'll have to start thinking about in terms of grant funding. How can we sustain this ecosystem that, as again Ramesh said, can come back to support our growth in terms of businesses, but also from a social contract perspective as well. So today, I think one of the key decisions the private sector will have to take is, how do you cover that lacuna, or are we going to wait till that it sustains? It's not going to, right? And it's going to have a detrimental point where I would say the pipeline of brilliant startups coming into the stage of angel investments to VCs would dry out, if not so. So I think this pre-seed funding piece, the early stage funding, is something I think the private sector can really leverage on. I know that we are going through tough macro environmental situations, but I think that's a cue. If we can set a tone, I think we can create a very strong momentum moving forward. And that's why even this time around, as part of the Global Entrepreneurship Week, even Brandix volunteered for the first time as a private sector to grant fund the complete Spiralation cohort for the year. So I think that's the intent, but I think we need more ecosystem builders coming into play, and I think that's critical, Vishant. I mean, I'm taking the current local scenario. I think we have to be completely tuned into the situation and see how the private sector can partner up, but also of course, from a public perspective, there has to be some sort of governance coming in from a GovTech of the likes, and that's where ICT will have to play a major role in bridging that corporate startup relationship. So I think that's important, and I think we have a good opportunity amidst these turbulent times to ensure that we continue that momentum you created on the vibrant Sri Lankan startup ecosystem. That's my thoughts on this.
Absolutely, absolutely. Oshada, would you say that we see most startups falling out of that funnel at that pre-seed stage, and that's sort of the crucial area you see that corporates can support and should support?
Yeah, absolutely, Vishant. Because see, again, I mean, with my previous stint of national duty, the significant amount of startups that is grappling with a very stereotypical and traditional banking system, to say so, pardon my language. But I think the situation there is the traditional way of gauging a startup is very different, right? You cannot gauge a startup like SME, right? The types of collateral would be absolutely different. And in like other countries, the banking or the finance sector has to hedge some bets and risks on to the success of that startup as well. So that's not happening. And that's hence the reason started talking about this alternative credit framework, for example, right? But that will take some time to evolve, and certain banks are coming in, certain financial institutions are coming with a much more pragmatic view on that. But again, my point is, I believe that the private sector can do more in terms of accelerating and then ensuring that we create that bridge amidst this lacuna that we have, Vishant. And yes, there's so much of startups that's drying off stamina, and these entrepreneurs are going back to traditional 9 to 5 job, and that's a significant opportunity we lose as a country, for example, because these could be potential unicorns that we envision, right? Like Sweden, like India has come up with so much of minting of unicorns again, right? And I think to cross that Rubicon in terms of getting that first unicorns or multiple unicorns, I think we have a big role to play from a private sector perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Oshada. Vindhya, from an insurance standpoint, what is it that your strengths are that startups can leverage? What can you lend to startups?
Yeah, I think we touched upon quite a
Yeah.
bit of that. Industry expertise is definitely one, Vishant. And also now, for an example, when we look at the how do we expand our digital distribution, right? Or we look at, say, for an example, partnering with a telemedicine provider, that would also mean that they get access to our customer database. So that will be a lot of, consumer insights out there. And also the reputation, right? Because especially now, I have one experience when I was attached to destination management sector, where we actually tied up with a startup, right? So they basically learned the industry ABCs from us. And the fact that they tied up with a company like us who had like a 50 years sort of history actually took them a long way. So that corporate reputation would be another thing which they can take advantage of. And also the corporate nuances. It can be now, I know John is X for an example. You guys basically have sessions on, it can be on marketing, it can be on finances, right? Taxation to internal controls or whatnot. So it might be corporate law, right? So I think even that knowledge of, different areas would facilitate startups. So those are some of the other things which I can think of, Vishant.
Great, great.
If
Thanks,
I may
Vindhya.
just chip in, I don't know. I personally
Please,
feel, I think
please.
the problem also lies in just what Vidya said, right? Because an insurance company will always think like an insurance company, right? That's where the problem is, right? So today the opportunity is the entire industry in terms of hospitals, pharmacies, doctors, citizens, banks, all these can come together to form the ecosystem. The question that we should ask ourselves is, what is the biggest ecosystem we could create where there will be stickiness, right? When we talk about ecosystems, I think it's important to kind of answer this question: what will stick? What creates the stickiness, right? If you can create an ecosystem which will stick for the consumer, everyone will benefit, right? So the question is, we are always trying to answer a problem for ourselves, not for the consumer, right? The moment you put the consumer at the center and then start creating the ecosystem, you will be building a bigger ecosystem than that you will imagine that you could build. I'll park myself there.
Absolutely, Ramesh. Thank you for those thoughts. So before we go into we are going into a bit of a fun segment. So to the audience, please feel free to drop in your questions in the chat. We can take your questions maybe at the end, or if you feel like it's suitable for this current segment, we can go for it. So please do send in your questions on the chat. And we go into a, I won't say controversial, but Jan, you touched on this, right? You've seen success and you've seen equal amount of failures. So in light of this, what should corporates avoid? What are the no-nos in a corporate startup relationship? We can be very honest. What are the no-nos?
No, I think, if you drill further down, right? So, you always have very exciting business leader like India here, right? Who wants to do something and wants to change something, right? And is excited by the opportunity. But then, as I said, as you go further down into the corporate world, it gets more and more difficult, right? And that's a fact in any corporate, yeah? So, and as closer you get to the core, the higher the costs are, of integration. And if your chief security officer comes in, and overlays all of this, it becomes all very lengthy, right? And as I said before, startups don't have the patience for all of this, right? They're running against the time. And by the way, no corporate in the world would deploy a pre-seed or seed stage startup, right? Apart from this, yeah, because the reputational risks are far too high. So then, even then, we are talking about a Series A and beyond. So what is then the winning model, right? Why don't we think about not deploying close to the core, and maybe we start creating new business lines? What about, to Ramesh's point, if you look into building the ecosystem, why does it need to be sit in the core business? Why can't this be a completely new company incubated within the corporate and built out from a greenfield approach rather than tying back into the core IT, and then have to deal with all these policies and regulations and build something completely new and fresh? And this can be done, as I said before, that's the concept what we call venture building, but it can also be done with a startup, right? It can be a startup, or you hire founders in and say, look, this is what I want. Please build it for me. And in return, I give you e-swaps, or I give you equity, or whatever you get in return. But it's completely changing the game. So stay away from the core. That's it. That's
Absolutely.
my...
On that model you just mentioned, Jan, I think you may have a fascinating example for this audience, which might surprise most. You want to dive into that, or we'll leave that for
I
later?
can
The icing
share.
on the cake.
For some companies might not know, but Tinder was built by Match.com. So Tinder was not a traditional startup. It actually came out of Match.com as a new business line, which is, I think, quite interesting. And Uber was also built as part of a venture studio rather than a traditional startup. But that's just a side story. But I like the idea of using and helping startups, because there's still a lot of people in the corporate environment who wants to change, who wants to do something new. But sometimes they even hold back by their own organization. So what is the right model? And I still go back, it's the greenfield approach.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jan. Rizni, you mentioned light touch before. What are the no-nos? What should corporates avoid in these relationships?
In terms of avoiding, I think one thing is clear. When I said light touch, so we've got different functional heads that typically, they've been given certain tasks within the organization. So something that we try to do is to mirror. So obviously, first thing I would say is the buy-in from the top. Ramesh, I think, already touched on that, so that's not something I want to go into. You need the buy-in from the top, and also at the same time identify the project lead, because it needs to be as flat as possible. Something that I see is when there is no real project ownership within the corporate, for someone to report back, because you don't see, the progress being given on a periodical basis. You need someone who has some level of sync with the culture, believes in that project, and also takes ownership for that as part of the corporate. Then that person also needs to bring in the different insights from individuals involved across the organization. For example, John Keys or Hemas, it doesn't have to be that specific domain. It can even, for example, be from healthcare. It can be from stationary for us, but different domain expertise could be brought in, insights, but again, you eject. Because or else what we typically see is, like I previously said, influence starts coming in, and project ownership kind of gets very difficult to see who's kind of controlling this project now, and it kind of fades away with their day jobs. One more thing is defining what success looks like. And typically, we can't look at this as a 12-month project or a 6-month project. If it's something that you want to bring within the corporate at some point. So expectation setting is, I think, crucial as well, because we do look at it again, typically how we would look at another transaction of ours. Even the startup, I think Ramesh touched on this. If it's a first or second startup, most of the time, their Excels are, those numbers are not even close to what they look like at the end of the year, and it doesn't continue. So those expectation settings, understanding and not defining success by what they make in the first couple of years is also crucial. So the problem statement needs to be properly defined.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rajni. Oshada, sure there are a lot of
Yeah,
no's. What
yeah,
should we avoid?
I think Vishant, it's about you need to understand it's a different journey which has to be segmented from your traditional annual business plan to ABPs or whatever, right? And it's the mindset of trying to grasp that whole adage of failing fast also, which you need to have to agree if you're investing on startups. And the second thing is you should ensure that how great idea is. I don't think that you should look at a short term return or a silver bullet for your P&L woes from a startup that you invested in. I think that's going to kill that. That's going to absolutely kill the momentum and that entrepreneurship spirit of a startup. So I think again, I think Ramesh also mentioned it. It's very important that you take it in a very different perspective. The mentoring and it's a complete shift of mindset. So I think the corporate that partners or invest has to also shift to that agile mindset. It's very important. I've seen so many times corporates investing and wanting returns on absolutely crazy timeline. I mean that runaway that's provided for startups is not sufficient. And if they fail fast, I would also say you need to have some sort of runaway left with the corporate to ensure that you handhold, and then let it fail, but also pick it up from there. So maybe that's so a big no-no is looking at a startup as a short-term return perspective. But again, to the point that as Jan said, if it's going to have a detrimental effect or issue of the credibility of the organization in investing on pre-seed funding, you can always partner up with a already established entity or entity, right? So that basically covers and gives that a safety net for the corporate, right? And we had our concerns as well. So I think that provides that. So I think Vishant, it's absolute mind shift change on how you handhold manage that whole journey towards driving that startup to success. I think that's key. If you're not geared up for it, I don't think it's going to be set for failure even before you start that journey.
Got it, Oshada. Ramesh, I saw you smiling when I was asking this question. I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
You're asking for what's the definite no, right? So I said, don't do it.
Yes.
Just tick a box. It's not fair, right? It's not stylish to say I'm reporting on triple bottom line. I'm doing ESG, or it's not stylish to say that I have a corporate venture which is funding startup. Because don't do it for the wrong reasons, right? So I think the key is important to understand, like what Jan said. I think very very important point, right? So you will need technology to further your business, your core business, right? So sometimes we will try to leverage a startup for our selfish reasons, and that's not the right reason to do this, right? So because you want to digitize your process, you want to digitize your business, fine. But is there a bigger, better ecosystem we could create by investing so that we also can give access? Because I think the biggest benefit that corporates brings to startup is scale, right? Startup wants to scale. Corporates already have a scale. We already have established customer base. We have established business, right? Established reach, right? So that's the easy thing for any startup to leverage. So are we creating an ecosystem that the startup could benefit from, whilst whether we have hidden or long-term intentions of getting benefit from the startup, you anyway have access that you could give by which your customers are going to benefit as well. You're creating stickiness for your own customers, right? So I think when we launched Smart Office for our own employees 3 years back, a lot of people asked me, why on earth do we need another application? I say it's not an application, right? If you see that as an application, it's dead, right? This is what we tend to look at things as technology, as an application, right? It's not an application. I said it is in the eye of the beholder. If you see opportunity, you see opportunity. You see a problem, you see problem. You see threats, you see threats, right? It's how you want to look at it.
Just want to add what Ramesh said, which is very, very important. And it speaks for the corporate as part of the cultivating a startup ecosystem. Is the corporate has the customer relationships. The startup has the technology. Okay. So if you can find a way to work jointly, you can become very, very powerful. So should not forget this. And that's why I think having the corporate as part of the startup ecosystem, to I think what everyone said here is extremely important.
Absolutely. Vindhya, you want to touch on the nose?
So Vishant, I think everyone quite summed it, quite touched upon it nicely. One is on the expectations to be clear and have that investor sort of mindset, and especially uh, the challenge that we see in a corporate environment is sometimes we tend to see the success of the startup looking at the traditional KPIs, looking at the financial matrices, because I'm also coming from a finance background, I'm saying it. So how do you buy in that stakeholder acceptance? And that is where I think, like Risni said, the top management commitment is important. There has to be like a sponsor. So how do you create that awareness? Because it's not as if you can take a very short term perspective and, like Oshada says, make sure that you need to see what are the real KPIs, right, where you want to monitor that traction. Because otherwise the challenge is, as I said, you might make quick decisions, knee jerk reactions, but are you committed to make that investment? And how receptive are you on changes, and then bouncing back, and the appetite that you have for failure. So I think all that is important for a corporate.
Thanks, Vindhya. Thanks. We have a question. I think it's a very interesting question. We can maybe get into that. We were talking about what we can lend as corporates. Uh, does anyone want to take this? What lessons from startups can corporates adopt, or what can we learn from startups?
So Vishanta, I think I'll
Fascinating
go for
question.
initially. I'll go for it
Please,
initially. I saw this popping up and
please.
it did. I think, see, corporates are absolutely, has insecurity over failing fast, right? We tend to basically ensure that everything is perfect but by that time, the time to market would have gone out, and the solutioning it would be completely redundant at the point of time that you roll out a certain point. So I think from startups, for corporates, the significant things to learn is that attitude, that agile attitude, and that failing fast mentality. The risk taking. How much corporates say that we do take risks. There are some hoops and hoops of different structures that gets validated and all of that. And I think that takes the wind off the possibility of corporates being the first player in innovation. So I think one big thing is that cultural mindset to adapt to that failing culture of fail fast. I think that's one of the keys for me.
Got it. Got it. Absolutely. Anyone else? I'm sure there's a lot
Just
of
want to
feedback
add
on
on
this one.
learn
Yes,
the
yes.
fail fast thing, right? It doesn't mean you can do the same mistakes twice or three times in a row, right? The idea of learn to fail is about learn from your mistakes and become better. Because some people misunderstand it like you can make the same mistakes 15 times, right? This is not. If you would do this in Google or on Microsoft or any tech company or startups, you'd be out, right? It's like you learn something out of every mistake you made to ultimately achieve where you want to be. I just want to chip this in because I heard this differently in different forums and interpretation.
If I may add to that, I think the important thing is to that what we could learn from startups is that challenging the status quo, right? Most corporates are comfortable with status quo and defend the status quo, right? They say, I have done it for 10 years. Why the hell should I change this, right? It has worked for me, right? And the next thing is the spirit of experimentation, right? Because today, if you go with an idea to your manager, how many managers will say, okay, this is the funding, go, show me what you could do, right? We'll have 101 questions as to why he should not be doing it, right? So the spirit of innovation is a cultural shift, right? So I think that the important thing is to embrace a culture of innovation is understand that we will not know it all, right? And we can learn from anybody and everyone. So I think that learning mindset, the spirit of experimentation and challenging the status quo, not getting comfortable with the as is too.
Ishan, just to add to what
Absolutely.
Ramesh said, I think it's dealing with
Please, yes.
uncertainty. dealing with uncertainty, the way we channel and the way a startup typically channels. I've been working with a few for the last 12 months. It's quite refreshing when you do table different discussions, the way how uncertainty is dealt with within that setup. And sometimes 2 hours later, you kind of think, okay, they're still around, they're still there because of certain issues. So the agility and dealing with uncertainty is something we corporates can definitely learn.
Not hitting the panic button too soon.
Yeah, and also analyzing.
Exactly.
Can
Got it. Got it. Vindhya, you have anything to add there? Brilliant question, by the way. Thank you for asking that.
So that's that entrepreneurial spirit, Vishant, I would say. Yeah.
Thanks. We have another question from Akalanka. Thanks for the question. I think one of the key challenges that startup owners struggle with is the lack of exit routes, right? Okay, the question is, can corporates play a part in helping a successful startup exit their business? The owners, the founders exit their business and focus on the next big problem. Anyone wants to take this?
I'll take this
And
one. My previous
personally, I
role-
think it's a wrong attitude. That you should not start something to exit,
Exactly.
right? I personally think so, because if you are starting something to exit, right, that's the wrong reason. But at some point down the line, if you think, okay, I have a better idea and and there's a person who could do this better than me, that's a different question, right? If you're expecting corporates to kind of acquire startups, then I think the entire ecosystem is going to collapse. Right? Then we are back to square one. Right? Here, I think today, if you look at why Sri Lanka is in this situation, is because everyone who graduates wants to be an employee of someone. I think we should be creating more entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs are the ones who should be kind of really driving growth, fueling growth, not looking at just, I want to kind of start up and kind of get a 10x return and exit. Right. That's a very short term thing which will kill this ecosystem. Right. I think exit is an option, but should not be something that you should dream of inside of 3 to 4 years or 5 years. Right. You should scale the business as much as possible, leverage each other's competency, maybe get a corporate take a stake, but a complete exit, I don't think would help the ecosystem. Because it's your idea.
Thanks, Ramesh. Rizni, you wanted to add something as well.
So in terms of both capital raising and seed capital, private equity, VC, if you compare us with the regions, we've not done that great. Some other startup examples that have been there in the ecosystem also have not done that well. So liquidity is a big issue. If you look at our stock market, which also tried to enable, they did introduce a new board recently. I'll take it more as capital raise than exit. So exit, like Ramesh said, if your skill set has reached this particular level where now you would rather be an employee and it's the ecosystem is too big for you, you don't have the financials, then an exit does make sense. Also personal circumstances come in, but other than that, I do agree that the options available for capital raises and to continue is not that great here. It did take off during the 2020 2022, both in Sri Lanka and globally, with easy money coming into the market. But now with rates going up and all, that's again going to be a difficult time. But of course, this is a cycle, right? So there's always a 3 to 7 year cycle which you'll have to time. So as a startup, like I said, you shouldn't look at it as a 12-month thing. So when last year or 2021, most of the startups that came to me to say this is a good time to risk, we told them whether the company was ready. If you are to exit or even raise capital, it's something that you have to plan easily 2 to 3 years ahead. Unless it's, of course, in a much more developed market where the capital markets have developed to the extent where you can go in 3 to 4 months.
Absolutely. In the current context, I think investors can double their money in 3 years, right? Given the current rates. Absolutely. We have another question. How would you convince the senior leadership of a traditional organization to adopt the mindset and attitudes required to partner with startups? I think Ramesh and Yan, you all touched on this. You want to elaborate? Anyone feel free to
I don't
go
think
for it?
it's the senior leadership for the board. I think the board is actually pushing down to do more. I think it's the middle management.
I
That's
think
interesting
a
take.
classic example that I could talk of even during COVID. I know all of you all know about what we did with the Keels as well, right? But post COVID, everyone had clamored back to the stores, right? So Keels, the mobile, as I said, just became another app, another channel, which probably is not living up to its true potential, right? So the issue is it the mobile app, is it the channel, or is it the customer? Or is it like Jan said, should we have run Keels Digital as a separate company, competing with the physical stores, right? The opportunity is in terms of what is that you really want to grow, right? If you look at that as a channel, all it will remain is as a channel, right? So the opportunity, as I said, is not only about the leadership; it's about the entire organization believing in that, because execution is not left to the leadership; it's to the entire supply chain. Because Keel's the biggest challenge is supply chain, right? So supply chain also needs to get reorg if we want to do a digital business, right? Then we got to go for a centralized inventory, centralized warehouse. Then distribution becomes the key, like Amazon or any other digital player, right? So it takes different skill sets to run the two different kinds of organizations. So when it's a hybrid, obviously there will be a compromise in terms of decisions that we would make, right? Which impacts the outcome. Right. So you can't just abdicate the responsibility only to the leadership. It's to the entire organization. And that's why we call it an ecosystem, right? Because no one today can possess the entire knowledge to claim supremacy over anyone else and say, I know it all. But obviously you need the sponsorship. Right? The sponsorship needs to come from the top. The conviction needs to come from the organization.
Got it. Got it. Oshada, you share the same views. It's all in the
So,
middle. All the action is in the middle.
So I share the same views, but coming back to the point of the exits also, I do agree. I think the table stakes for any startup has to be the fact that the commitment of the founders has to be table stakes for me, right? Otherwise, it is always a red flag. You, as Ramesh said, you cannot just expect the investing party or the corporate in that matter to basically take it up and run it away with it, right? It's a commitment which is key. But in terms of I think again it's a top down and a bottom up for me. I think the top down is the intent from the board in terms of the concept of digital in the core as organization. You know, how do you contribute back to the startup ecosystem and how do you be that ecosystem builder? That has to come from the board itself. So that's a strategic direction from the organization. But yes, absolutely, the tactical aspect has to come in from the middle management. So the tactical piece is something that I think is critical for the success of the journey. So that is absolutely yes, it's that operational strategy that comes into play on how do you engage and how do you basically continue to grow and mentor the startup. So that's right on the ground. You know, it's a heavy lifting that's on the bottom layer that has to continue.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Vindhya, you were hands on. I think you and your teams are hands on with the whole integration with Hiaga, and I think you're working with a few other startups and a couple of other things. What are your thoughts on that?
So for us to start this journey and convince not only the management, but like Ramesh correctly said, the rest of the stakeholders, what actually helped us was the regional success story. So we really studied and we looked at whether, those are applicable in the Sri Lankan context or what parallels we can draw. Then moving on from there, we had to do a lot of awareness sessions. How do you get, because our challenge was sometimes the traditional insurance, agents, the bank assurance, IROs, distribution channels. And for me, it was anyway challenging because I had a traditional distribution channel as well. So, how do we convince them? How do we convince our bank partners? How do we show value for them? So that was one of the key challenges that we had. And so I believe first your internal stakeholders should believe in this, right? They should internalize and then, drive it as part of the DNA. That I believe is very important, Vishant.
Absolutely. Thanks. We have more questions coming in. Let me take Ahmed's question. Panelists, feel free to take in questions. What's the main key to win the trust? What's the key to win the trust of customers? And also, is there any kind of boundary when it comes to setting realistic and unrealistic expectations? Anyone wants to take this? Since the twofold question, first one is on winning the trust of customers. Second is on creating those expectations.
Yeah,
So I think in terms of customers, Vishant, I think it's about transparency, I mean, being true to your customers and ensure that there's this clear communication that has to be established, whether even if it's a situation that is not ideal. But I also think while you do that, it's important that you have fanatical support, right? And that's something that's critical as you scale up. Sometimes startups, tend to not focus too much on the customer front, but only focus on the top line growth, for example. I mean, that's all for good reasons. But I think that fanatical support and also ensuring that transparency, but also accessibility to the customers to the top, because this is something that the customers will get used to when you're a startup, right? But as you go along, how do you keep true to that sort of brand promise as you go along to scale up? And that's a bit of a tightrope you need to tread on, right? And then some customers demand your face times in certain times. So there's no right or wrong, but I think in general terms, it's about ensuring that you continue that value system of being transparent and keeping the clients engaged. I think that's key.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
I think the
I
first
think
few
that's
phases
important.
Yeah.
I think it's important, but also say I think it's important to be truthful and transparent, because when you kind of screw up, own it, right? Don't kind of say that it's not our fault, and So the issue is about ultimately you also need to be very clear what is the problem that you're trying to solve for your customer, right? That's what creates stickiness. I kind of go back to that question of what creates stickiness for the customer, right? So you pivot because you want to increase the stickiness, right? So you always look at, okay, I have solved this problem for him. Now, what is the next problem? Now, I can say, okay, COVID, they can come to the store. Now, okay, I have given them a storefront, digital storefront. So next is going to be, okay, can you deliver this goods to my doorstep? So next thing is going to be, can you make the vegetables that you're supplying fresher than what you're doing today, right? So the expectations of the customer will keep growing, right? You can't stop them. The issue is you need to be very clear what is a problem that you can solve at scale to sustain your business. It's your choice whether you want to solve it or not, right? So if you might decide not to solve it, someone else might want to solve it. Then you obviously have a joint play. So I don't want to maybe do delivery. I can partner with PickMe, right? But I still can achieve the same results the customer wants by creating the ecosystem, right? That is where your answer lies, is that, okay, customer has expectation. Do I want to deliver it, or do I want to build an ecosystem to deliver it? Right? Do I want to use my own assets or leverage someone else's assets to do it? Right? That's where the choice is. And that's why this is so powerful. You can collectively keep enhancing your value proposition to the customer incrementally.
Absolutely. Jan, you had a thought?
So I was on mute. No, it's just like, focusing more like which customer basically, you're talking about. But I mean, obviously building trust is for me always tied back to the outcome. So trust is something where I want to see the outcome, and that builds trust over time. So not much more to add here, to be honest.
Got it. I think, Jan, there's a question directly for you on maybe hearing more about your corporate ventures angle and how Microsoft has sort of played in that space and how you're focusing there.
Well, I think there are a lot of very exciting, examples I can show, but I think the most public one is probably Commonwealth Bank in Australia, where CBA wants to build 25 new business lines.
25.
Yeah, 25 new business lines for 15 million customers. It's called CBA X15. It's a very interesting approach, I find, because it's really focusing on new channels, engaging with customers in a different way. It goes after ecosystems, to what Ramesh said. So, for example, one of their Most prominent one is probably the home buying ecosystem. So really touching all, touch points from the beginning. I'm thinking about buying a house. That's where I came out with a, venture called Home In, which is a concierge service. Then later on, you're coming to, okay, now I want to buy a house. Now I will need a loan. So there's Unloan, where you get a loan within 10 minutes. And then there's several other basically companies in play. So I think that's a very interesting one. So it's a combination of the ecosystem, what I said before, but also building new basically channels, new distribution channels, new ways to engage. But to an extent also leverages the banking license of CBA, which we shouldn't forget here, right? You're not getting a loan in 10 minutes without having a banking license in place. So I think they found a really exciting, interesting model. At least that's how I interpret it. At least that's what I can share. And that's the work, where Microsoft is involved.
Fascinating. 25 new business lines. Brilliant. So I think we're almost done for time. If there are no more questions, maybe we can go into quick 20-second closing remarks of the panel. We start with Ramesh.
I would take all the world, be bold, right? I think if you have a dream, I know you need to kind of look at the filters in terms of whether it's practical in terms of the opportunity that you're seeing. But take the challenge on, right? Don't take no for an answer, right? Because if someone else has done it, you wouldn't be kind of talking about it. So if no one else has done it, why not?
Thanks, Ramesh. Thanks. Oshada?
Yeah, I would say startups, continue to hustle and ideate and challenge the status quo continually and keep that punch of, always trying to create a differentiate and that's what it is and keep failing fast and yeah, said don't make the same mistake twice, but but failing fast is fine as long as you don't make the same mistake twice, you learn from it. That's great, and then continue to build relationships, and that's key for growth of a startup. Continue to build that bridges with the private sector, public sector, whatever it is, and that's important piece and element that people tend to ignore. So focus on these key areas, and you're set for success.
Absolutely. Vindhya?
I would say challenge the status quo, and if you have confidence, go for it.
Short and sweet. Thank you, Vindhya. Rizni, go for it.
Yeah, I would say, we're going through a tough phase. So for entrepreneurs as well, it's not an easy time to experiment stuff. But what I can tell you is don't underestimate how much corporates need you. I know that, if there was funding that was mentioned, there was so many things that were mentioned, but don't underestimate how much corporates need you at a time like this. And I would say be very confident and go and speak to them because I'm sure they're looking for you or someone like you.
Absolutely. Ayan, last
I
but
think-
not least.
Yeah, be persistent. I think you will go through, every startup goes through a lot of setbacks. Just be persistent, never give up. And that's the right, I think, attitude you need to bring in to be successful.
And Microsoft had all the dollars.
Correct.
Fact check.
True.
Brilliant. So we can maybe then close this panel. Thank you so much to the panel. You've been absolutely brilliant, fascinating discussion. Learned a lot myself. Hoping we can do more of these types. I think we want to sort of encourage more corporates to get involved with startups exactly at a time like this, where both of us need each other, right, equally. Like Rizni very correctly said, we need them, they need us. So let's be a beacon of light and make this work. Mariam, over to you for closing remarks, if any.
Yeah, wow, guys, what an insightful, yes, but open discussion on forging corporate and startup relationships. I guess, like everything in life, we have challenges to overcome, but one thing is abundantly clear: we have great potential to work better together. Thank you, speakers. Thank you, audience. You've been amazing, and I hope you have a super evening ahead of you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Good evening,
you.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.